So stop and think about the communities maybe you grew up in, you travel through, and some of the comments that our panel is shared with you. And again, remember, if you've got questions or input, what have you, there's microphones right there. I'm going to talk about one that I think is kind of the elephant in the room, connectivity. I know all three of you kind of alluded to it in different parts of your graph, but forgive me, as a farm broadcaster, it is in our face all the time how much our rural audience, and they don't have to be farmers. I'd like to think I can kind of appeal to almost anybody. Our rural communities have zip for connectivity unless they go to the public library, school, McDonald's. And that's not just the wire, that's the cell phone too. And every time, and I can hear this, I was berated by a sweet little old lady that said, every time I see you on TV, you've got a website. All the information I need is on a website. I have no internet. So what is that as far as an element for each of your quests? And where are we at? Because God knows every other story we talk about is how much money the government's throwing at it. And that's been for how long? Tell me, give me an update. What say you about connectivity helping you accomplish everything you're after?
I'll go ahead and start. Broadband is an issue that we're working on a lot with a lot of communities around the state of Wisconsin. It's a bit of a slow process, unfortunately. But if anything good came out of the pandemic, it did make communities realize how important broadband is for healthcare, for talent attraction retention, for quality of life, for education, and all these other factors that make a community livable. And there is money coming. We are getting $1.1 billion for broadband expansion in the state of Wisconsin. Most of that will be targeted towards 100, 200 speed, so above and beyond the traditional definition of broadband. And we'll also prioritize fiber rather than fixed wireless when possible. So it's not coming as fast as we want it to, but it is coming, and we do recognize, I think even more so, how important it is for our rural communities.
Yeah, I think just to tack onto that too, what we know about how the federal investments are coming to our state is through this BEAD planning process, which is much more comprehensive than our prior kind of methods of broadband expansion funding, which were basically the communities that had the capacity to do the research, figure out where the grants or where the gaps were in service, find a partner, write a grant, et cetera, were the communities that got funded. Whereas the BEAD process is a little bit more equitable because it has some planning dollars associated with it, and all communities are required to be part of like a BEAD planning unit, whether it be at the county level or the regional level. So we know that rural communities that maybe were not previously able to access some broadband resources will hopefully have a better shot through the bipartisan infrastructure law. The other thing I just want to highlight, though, is we always talk about access and we never talk about affordability and digital literacy. And those are super important from a healthcare perspective because the cost of broadband is still challenging for some individuals. And even if they have service, do they know how to utilize all the digital tools that are available to us, especially when we think about telehealth, remote monitoring, scheduling visits online, all of these things that where healthcare and broadband interact, that digital literacy piece is super important, and utilizing libraries and community centers and other kind of anchor institutions to help connect individuals with broadband tools is going to be really critical.
I don't have a ton to add to that because they covered the main points, but I'll say I do know that a lot of the locations that'll be eligible for BEAD funding have been kind of put into a state plan, and there's currently a challenge process that's underway. UW Extension's been helping to educate communities about that challenge process. There are a few steps communities have to go through to be able to participate in that challenge process. So use Extension as a resource to learn more about how to do that, because all of those locations then by May will be kind of outlined, and that's what a lot of the grant funding that will be coming through will be utilizing. So just taking that opportunity to be proactive and engage in some of that data now can help in a few months when those grants open up.
Paul?
I have a question for you, and I learned a lot about some of the things like I don't know how to say it.
EDC.
WEDC, I got to say it, or in the rural health cooperatives. And what I'm kind of looking for is like, what are the biggest challenges? Like, is it a lack of awareness of these kind of programs or the activities they do? Is it a lack of interest by the rural communities? Or are we doing all right? Or what's our biggest impediments to making rural Wisconsin more livable? Is it something that's outside of our control, like large economic forces that we can't control, social trends, or is it something we can do about it? I'm just kind of curious what your experience is trying to tell you. What are the biggest challenges that are preventing us from improving rural livability?
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's probably a combination of both. I think it's systemic challenges, and then I think it's awareness and that ability to actually navigate some of the programs that are out there. And so I think there's a lot more that can be done to make both state and federal resources more um, accessible to rural communities. I think typically they're designed for problems of scale, and you have a scale issue at the rural level because you have less population. And so it really is being creative about how to work collaboratively or create regional approaches to some of these solutions. Uh, so I think that's one thing that I think we can work more towards. I think making things as easy as possible is something we heard a lot in our rural listening sessions, like breaking down everything you're going to need to be able to apply for a grant on the front end so people know what they're getting into. Because I think what you'll find a lot of times is people aren't aware when they're first applying for the grant what the reporting requirements are. And they might get the grant and then be like, we don't have the capacity to manage this. And then it stops that particular project or initiative from moving forward. So the more that we can help be proactive in breaking down programs, helping explain them, being sure people are really aware what they're getting into. Again, it's not a lack of talent or willingness at the local level. It's just a lack of having a full-time staff member that larger cities or municipalities have that's focused on just doing that. So how do we help break that down into actionable steps where people can really access what's available to them?
Yeah, I have a couple comments on this. The first probably comes from the fact I'm an optimist, but I grew up in Georgia, and then I moved to Wisconsin as an adult, and so I always kind of juxtapose the two regions of the country. And I think that rural Wisconsin has so many assets to build upon that give me a lot of hope for the future of rural communities. But I think one of the challenges, right, is the phrase that if you've seen one rural community, you've seen one rural community, and all of their challenges are unique. There's not like these cookie cutter solutions that fix everything. And just to play devil's advocate, as wonderful as state and federal resources are, they haven't figured out how to solve everything. I think specifically about the childcare challenge that we see in a lot of our rural communities. Each community is really having to craft pretty specific local solutions to help with the sustainability of that really critical piece of infrastructure in rural communities. So there's still, like Beth was mentioning, is a lot of really localized work that has to occur. And communities have to have the capacity to do that work and solve challenges that exist in their communities.
Yeah, and certainly there are structural issues that rural Wisconsin faces and other rural Wisconsin or rural communities throughout the United States face as well. So we can't just ignore that there are some underlying factors that we're facing and when it comes to rural livability. But I do want to build on one of the things that Beth said, and I do think regional cooperation is an area where we've made a lot of progress over the last couple of decades, but it's one where I think we can continue to grow because it does go back to capacity. If every community is against every other community, we just don't have the resources and the abilities to build everyone up at the same time. That's great that your football team is a rival of the neighbor community over there. Keep that up. But at the same time, find ways to work together because you face similar issues. You face similar economic opportunities, and you often share a labor market.
That's hard. That's hard though. Go ahead.
Yeah, my name is Jeff Hadacek, and I'm a new assistant professor and extension specialist in the Department of Ag and Applied Economics. Beth, you talked about sort of the funding that's available for renewable energy transition in a lot of rural areas. But I think if you talk to folks that live in these rural areas, that may be sometimes a disamenity to live there as well, which kind of stands in contrast to what you were talking about, Matt. So I am curious if you talk to that tension a little bit, how you preparing sort of communities for additional rural renewable energy opportunities that are oftentimes being implemented on agricultural lands.
I can start. So a few of the projects we've worked on actually haven't engaged a farmland. They've been more about cost savings at the municipal or county level. So making sure to transition municipal or county buildings or village buildings with solar or other energy saving technology. We were looking at one project in Bayfield County to transition snowplows into electric vehicles, and the cost savings that would allow them to hire additional staff to manage all of the engineering considerations of doing that. So I think that's what we've seen through our office is really thinking about it through the economic standpoint of transitioning to renewable energy and how that can benefit the bottom line of the local government.
I would basically just say ditto to that response. We have a number of hospitals that have been quite forward thinking when it comes to new renewable energy adoption. Specifically, Gunderson Health System is the first health system in the nation that produces as much energy as they consume as a health system, which is a unique fact. And we've seen it with our independent hospitals too, in terms of solar and adoption of other renewable energy technologies. And for them, it again comes back to financial sustainability. When they can drive down those operating costs, it makes them more sustainable over the long term as a rural healthcare organization. But I'd also say, just like as a rural resident, I think that the land use question you brought up is something that our state does not have a comprehensive answer to, and that we need to do more forward thinking planning and community engagement around. Because I think that many of our responses at the local level, when debates around land use between agriculture and renewable energy come up, are more reactive than proactive. And that's an area where our rural communities could grow.
And this is an area I have a lot of direct expertise in, but I do know one of our state specialists, Sherry Gruder, is active in this area, working with communities to think about strategies related to things like how do you put EV chargers in tourist communities to help attract people that may be driving electric vehicles to those areas and make them know that they can get a reliable charge. We also have a number of our county extension educators that are working with some of those issues related to land use and in terms of things like solar field development, land use change, and having those community conversations with the parties involved.
Can I ask you to comment on the housing challenge? Because we've been fortunate to share stories about rural communities that got creative primarily for labor force for local dairies. Then we found out about other stories where it's kind of like that, not in my backyard. How do you try to help bridge those conversations? Because whether you like it or not, as an old broad that grew up in rural Wisconsin, there are still stigmas that you've got to work around, regardless of grant monies, regardless of available resources and things like that. And housing might be one of those. Just wondered what your experiences have been. Maybe a positive, and maybe one where it stubbed its toe or something like that.
Yeah, I can give some positive stories. One example that's been very positive is Door County Medical Center. They have been really outspoken advocates for the need for workforce housing in a very tourism-driven community that's seen significant increases in home prices since the pandemic. And really, the position they have taken is one of education. They've been able to share stories where they've had inpatient nurses living in the back of yoga studios, x-ray techs living in sheds, and been able to paint the picture that if individuals in their community value continued access to healthcare services locally, those people need somewhere to live. And that helps to battle some of the stigma you're talking about when individuals say, I don't want, these people not in my backyard. When you can personify that individual as the person that helps grandma when she falls and breaks her leg, I think it starts to change community conversations.
Absolutely. I mean, I think education is a huge part of it. We're also seeing, in addition to the healthcare industry, we're seeing manufacturing and hospitality establishments across the state either become directly or indirectly involved with creating workforce housing. And I think part of that is helping the community understand why we need this type of housing in our community and why it will benefit the community going forward. There's certainly stigma there. I don't think that's just restricted to rural areas. I think that happens when you talk about workforce housing in almost any community in rural and urban areas alike. But I think we are making progress. This is a topic that I don't go into a single community and not hear about. And I think it is something that is increasingly going to receive the attention it needs to and find the solutions going forward that we need.
Interesting.
Yeah, I would echo that. We've heard the same, the workforce challenges related to housing are huge in rural communities and tribal communities throughout the state. I believe this most recent statistic was 140,000 units that Wisconsin is short on housing. So it is a huge challenge, and one of the biggest barriers, I think, to job creation and economic growth. We just on a call this morning, we were discussing a recent grant that WDC did in Ladysmith, transitioning a vacant school building into housing, and I think there's a lot of opportunity there with looking at some of those municipal buildings or school buildings that are no longer being occupied. How do we bring those sites back to active use and use them to solve for a major issue in the community as well?
I add one more thing. I think oftentimes one area we have to make progress is that in rural communities, density is a dirty word, and really density helps farmland preservation, right? When we're able to have more individuals living in spaces that are already developed. And I think that is also an area of opportunity for the ag community and rural economic development folks to work together.
Very good. One more.
Since this is an Outlook forum, I was curious for your outlook on the rural Wisconsin economy, or what areas do you see most promise or progress, and what areas are facing most difficulty, be sector or geography?
Didn't Steve cover that this morning?
Anecdotes are fine too.
It's just one I mentioned before, and I do see a lot of progress coming in broadband. I think that's a real area of growth. There are some challenges, no doubt about it, with it, especially related to things like workforce. So as we're trying to build this infrastructure, we simply just don't have the workers that have the skills to put the fiber in the ground or build the towers. So that's still a challenge going forward, but I am very optimistic that we will have universal coverage in the state in the next 5 to 10 years.
One of the challenges I see, which Matt alluded to in his presentation, are the kind of differences between communities that are potentially high amenity, high natural resource, or urban adjacent with a high quality of life that are able as rural communities to really tackle challenges and grow. Whereas we have some other rural communities that are struggling with some of those shrinking and aging demographics that maybe don't have as much capacity to tackle the challenges they see. And I personally would be concerned about kind of deepening inequities between those two rural communities. One area of opportunity or promise that I see is a lot of our rural communities are thinking differently about the demographics of the future and realizing that welcoming immigrants and newcomers is part of a really vital economic revitalization strategy for their community, and being more strategic about what welcoming looks like in their communities. And I find that really exciting and promising and hopeful.
I think going back to my presentation, I think one of the most exciting things that I see is the way that communities are addressing placemaking and really thinking about their local identity, and where, like, instead of looking backwards on who they used to be as a community, looking forward and looking for resources through extension and other regional partners that can help them do that planning to know, like, this is what we want to be known for in 5 years or 10 years. And I think creating those unique identities not only supports the economy, but also just builds that community pride and that sense of connectivity, not only through broadband, but just the social networks and the support networks that exist within a community. And I think rural communities do that well already, but it's not often formalized or bragged about or talked about as much as it could be. And I think there's all of the pieces are there. It's just about elevating them and really, proudly sharing that's the brand that they want to have moving forward. That's what they want to be known for.
Very good. Very good dialogue. Matt, Marie, Beth, thank you very much.